When I first pulled into the neighborhood with the moving truck trailing behind me, I thought I had finally reached the kind of life I had been working toward for years. The wide streets were lined with towering oak trees that spilled their branches over the asphalt like guardians of old secrets. Each house looked like it had been pulled straight from the glossy pages of a real estate brochure, complete with symmetrical flower beds, spotless driveways, and fences so perfectly painted they seemed untouched by weather or time. The crown, jewel of it all, though, was the lake. It wasn't just a pond or a man-made retention basin. No, this was a sprawling, glistening expanse of water, its surface catching the morning light like a sheet of polished glass. Ducks drifted lazily near the reeds, and the distant hum of outboard motors signaled that residents used it freely for boating and fishing. The realtor, during our many viewings, had made sure I knew just how coveted this lake view was. She spoke about sunsets that melted into the water, the calm ripple of waves against the docks, and how residents spent their summers basking in the privilege of lakeside living. I had fallen in love with it instantly. The house could have been half as nice, and I still would have bought it for the lake alone. What she hadn't mentioned, however, was that the lake came with more than sunsets and scenery. It came with watchers, self-appointed guardians who believed it was their duty to control every blade of grass, every fence post, and every ripple on that water. It came with the HOA. I had been in the house for less than 24 hours when they made their entrance. No warm welcome, no basket of muffins from a smiling neighbor, no friendly handshake introducing themselves. Instead, 3 people marched up my driveway in rigid formation. 2 men and a woman, all wearing collared shirts with the HOA's crest embroidered over their hearts. They held clipboards like they were weapons, their pens poised as if ready to write me up on sight. They didn't so much knock as they did pound, sharp, demanding thuds that rattled the freshly painted door. When I opened it, they didn't greet me. Their eyes swept past me into my entryway, cataloging boxes and furniture as though inspecting for violations. Their leader, a tall man with thinning hair combed back in a style that tried to look authoritative but only made him appear severe, stepped forward with the air of someone convinced of his own importance. "Homeowners Association," he announced, his voice clipped, every syllable soaked in condescension. The other 2 nodded sharply, standing behind him like soldiers flanking a general. They wasted no time on pleasantries. The woman who wore oversized sunglasses even though we were standing. In the shade of my porch, cut straight into her lecture, she spoke quickly with a rehearsed rhythm, explaining how the lake belonged to the HOA, how no resident could use it without proper authorization, and how rules were in place to protect the integrity of the community. Every sentence ended with the threat of fines, penalties, or further action. The second man, short, stocky, and with a permanent scowl etched onto his face, interrupted her occasionally, adding little jabs about how new residents often misunderstand how things work here. His voice was gravelly, like he'd spent a lifetime barking orders, and he clearly relished the chance to put me in my place before I'd even had a chance to sit on my back porch and enjoy the view. I listened quietly, though my patience thinned with each passing second. They hadn't come to welcome me. They had come to remind me of their power. Every word dripped with arrogance, as though I should feel grateful they had taken time out of their day to tell me how things were done. They listed rules I had never agreed to, restrictions that seemed absurdly specific. No fishing without permits, no swimming outside of designated zones, no modifications to docks without approval. And always, there was a fee attached. By the end of their tirade, I had lost count of how many times they had used the word violation. But here's what they didn't know. I had done my homework. Unlike most residents, I hadn't skimmed over the deed and covenants. I had studied them. I knew that the boundary lines of my property didn't just brush up against the lake, they extended into it. More importantly, The land beneath several of the docks the HOA so proudly claimed jurisdiction over was mine. Legally, indisputably mine. So while they postured on my porch, waving their clipboards like scepters, I simply let them speak. I nodded politely, even feigned a look of concern when they threatened me with hefty fines should I step out of line. But inside, I was already piecing together a picture of what was to come. These people believed they had authority over me, yet they had no idea that the very foundation of their supposed power, the lake itself, rested on land I controlled. Their visit ended as abruptly as it began. The tall man gave me a final, stern look and declared that I was not to use the lake without written approval from the HOA. The woman adjusted her sunglasses, scribbled something on her clipboard, and offered a smug smile that suggested she thought the matter was closed. The stocky man muttered something about rookie mistakes, and then turned sharply on his heel. Together, they marched back down my driveway like victors leaving a battlefield, convinced they had put me in my place. But as I closed the door, the silence of my new home felt different. I walked to the back porch, stepping out into the fresh air, and let my eyes settle on the water. It shimmered under the late afternoon sun, calm and inviting, its surface dotted with docks that residents believed were untouchable HOA property. A slow smile spread across my face. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they had established dominance on day one. But what they didn't realize was that by trying to intimidate me, they had already set the stage for their own downfall, because this wasn't just a lake. It was leverage. And soon enough, the HOA would learn the difference between imagined authority and actual ownership. This was only the beginning. The morning after my encounter with the HOA felt different. I woke early, not because I wanted to, but because the neighborhood seemed designed to rise with the sun. Lawnmowers buzzed in the distance, sprinklers ticked rhythmically across manicured lawns, and somewhere down the street, a barking dog reminded everyone who really ran the block. From my back porch, I sipped my coffee and stared out at the lake. It was calm, peaceful, and beautiful, everything I had imagined when I signed the papers. But the taste of the coffee was bitter, not from the brew, but from the sour encounter still lingering in my mind. The HOA hadn't wasted a single day. They had stormed in, demanding control, expecting obedience, as though my moving truck had been an invasion into their little kingdom. Yet even as irritation simmered in my chest, I couldn't help but feel amused. They were playing a game of power. But they didn't realize the board belonged to me. I decided not to let them know immediately. Information, I reminded myself, is most valuable when used strategically. If I had revealed my ownership of the lakefront land right then, they might have backpedaled, recalibrated, and tried to find loopholes to maintain their control. No, I wanted them to keep underestimating me. I wanted them to believe I was just another resident they could bully with their thick binders of rules. The longer they believed that, the bigger the impact when I revealed the truth. That morning, as if on cue, I witnessed my first real glimpse of their grip on the neighborhood. Across the water, a man was unloading fishing gear onto a dock. He was middle-aged, wearing a faded baseball cap and a relaxed grin that suggested he had done this countless times. He cast his line into the water with practiced ease. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misjudged the HOA's stranglehold. Maybe. People here did enjoy the lake freely, despite the lecture I'd received, but then came the sound of footsteps. Two figures in those same HOA polo shirts appeared from a side path, clipboards in hand. They approached the man with the kind of forced authority that screamed, "Hall monitor with a badge." I couldn't hear the exact words from my porch, but the man's smile quickly faded. His shoulders stiffened as they gestured toward his fishing rod, pointing at his cooler, writing something down on their forms. The man tried to argue. His hands rose defensively, his voice carrying just faintly across the lake, but the HOA reps didn't budge. After several minutes, he pulled his line out of the water, packed up his gear, and trudged back to his house, his head low. The HOA wrote a few more notes, exchanged satisfied nods, and disappeared back into the path they came from. I sat back, in my chair, stunned not at what had happened, but at how blatant it had been. They weren't protecting the lake. They weren't maintaining order. They were policing joy. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I walked the neighborhood, introducing myself under the guise of being the new guy. The residents were polite, but there was a weariness in their eyes, a hesitation in their voices whenever the HOA came up. Some warned me quietly to be careful about leaving things visible in my yard or trimming hedges too low. Others rolled their eyes at the mention of the board, as though they had long since given up fighting. It didn't take long to see the cracks in the facade. Behind the manicured lawns and picture-perfect exteriors were whispers of resentment. The HOA had created a culture of compliance, not community. People followed the rules not because they believed in them, but because the alternative was harassment, fines, and public shaming. And then came the docks. Standing near the shoreline, I noticed something peculiar. Several docks were clearly built on sections of land that, according to the survey in my deed, belonged to me. The boundary lines weren't ambiguous. They were precise. Stakes had been driven into the ground decades ago when the lakefront was first divided and those lines had never shifted. Yet the HOA had allowed, or perhaps encouraged, residents to build docks under the belief they were communal property. The realization was delicious. Those docks weren't just structures. They were symbols of the HOA's authority. Families tied their boats to them. Children jumped off them in the summer, and the HOA proudly enforced rules about their use. But legally, they rested on my land. That night, I pulled out the stack of documents I had brought with me, the deed, the surveys, the maps. Under a lamp's glow, I traced the property lines again and again, making absolutely certain I wasn't mistaken. The more I read, the more it sank in. I didn't just own a slice of shoreline. I owned leverage over nearly half the lake's functional access points. The HOA could posture, threaten, and fine me all they wanted, but without access to those docks, their power crumbled. Residents would quickly turn from fearful compliance to anger, not at me, but at the board that had lied to them for years. The next morning, the HOA returned. This time it was just the tall man and the woman with sunglasses. They stood on my porch again, smiling in a way that was meant to look polite, but carried the sharpness of a knife hidden behind a smile. "We just wanted to follow up," the tall man said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Make sure you understand how things work around here. We like to keep everything orderly," the woman chimed in, adding that they'd be keeping a close eye on my property to help me avoid violations. Her smile was saccharine, but her eyes were cold. I thanked them, kept my tone measured, and assured them I understood. Inside, though, my patience was wearing thin. Their arrogance was astounding, their assumption of control almost laughable. They thought I was intimidated. They thought their presence was enough to keep me in line. But standing there, watching them march away yet again, I knew the storm was coming. They had declared war over the lake. They just didn't realize I already held the battlefield, and soon the neighborhood would see the truth. This wasn't about rules. This was about control, and I was ready to break their grip, one dock at a time. For most people, moving into a new neighborhood means settling in quietly, unpacking boxes, meeting neighbors, learning the rhythm of the community. For me, it meant waking up each morning wondering what new tactic the HOA would use to assert themselves. The tall man, the sunglasses woman, and their scowling sidekick had already made it clear. They considered themselves the gatekeepers of this lake, the guardians of order. But the truth was, their order was nothing more than control wrapped in the thin paper of rules. I wasn't about to let them think I was just another compliant resident. The first small test came on a Saturday morning. The sun was warm, the lake inviting. I pulled a chair down to my slice of shoreline, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat back to watch the rippling water. I didn't fish, didn't swim, didn't so much as dip my toes in, just sat there, enjoying the peace of what was legally mine. Within minutes, my quiet morning turned into a spectacle. 2 HOA board members appeared from the path again, as if they had been hiding in the bushes waiting for me to step out of line. Their polo shirts were pressed, their clipboards ready. "Excuse me," the tall man barked, marching toward me. "This area of the lake is for authorized use only. You can't set up furniture here without prior approval." Furniture. That's what he called a single folding chair. I raised my eyebrows, sipped my coffee, and asked calmly, "On my own property?" The woman adjusted her sunglasses, tilting, her head with that smug little grin. "The lake is community property. You should have received the guidelines packet in your welcome folder." I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just let their words hang in the air, sipping my coffee slowly, like their threats were background noise. The silence seemed to unsettle them. They scribbled on their clipboards, muttered something about issuing a warning, and stormed off down the path again. That was the moment I knew exactly how fragile their power was. They thrived on fear, on people reacting, panicking, obeying. When faced with calm defiance, they didn't know what to do. Later that day, while strolling the shoreline, I noticed other residents giving me quick glances. One older couple whispered to each other as I passed. A man unloading groceries nodded politely but didn't make eye contact. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been trained to avoid drawing attention to themselves, fearful that any misstep might trigger the wrath of the HOA. But there was one exception. Near the far end of the lake, I met James, a wiry man in his late 50s with sun-tanned skin and a boat that looked older than some of the homes. He was tightening ropes on his dock when I approached. At first, he looked wary, the same guarded expression I had seen in others, but when I introduced myself and casually mentioned the HOA, his face darkened. "They've been running this place like their own fiefdom for years," he muttered, pulling the rope taut. "Used to be, neighbors just minded their own business. Then those 3 got on the board. Now everything costs money, everything needs approval. They even fined me last year for painting my dock without their color guidelines." Can you believe that? I could. After all, I had already seen their pettiness firsthand. We talked for nearly an hour. James told me about families who had been driven to sell their homes after too many fines piled up, about kids who weren't allowed to swim off the docks because the HOA claimed it was a liability risk, about barbecues shut down mid-meal, because they violated fire safety codes. The more he spoke, the more I understood just how deeply the HOA's claws had sunk into this place, and the more certain I became that I was going to change it. That night, I sat at my desk with the deed spread out in front of me. My property wasn't just a house and a strip of shoreline. It was the linchpin of the entire lake. Nearly half the docks were built on land that technically belonged to me. If I chose to restrict access, the HOA would lose its biggest bargaining chip overnight. But I wasn't ready to play that card just yet. First, I needed to test how far the HOA was willing to push me. The next week, I made a small move. I bought a modest fishing rod, nothing fancy, and walked down to the edge of the lake. I cast my line into the water and waited, pretending to be absorbed in the quiet act of fishing. I didn't have to wait long. Like clockwork, the HOA arrived. The scowling man this time, alone but no less aggressive. "Fishing without a permit is a violation," he barked, clipboard at the ready. I reeled in the line slowly, calmly, and asked, "According to whose authority?" He blinked, momentarily, thrown off. "The HOA's authority. All residents must apply for fishing permits. It's in the bylaws." I smiled faintly. "Interesting. Because my deed doesn't mention anything about needing permission to use my property." His face reddened, his jaw tightening. He scribbled furiously on his clipboard, muttered something about escalating this to the board, and stormed off. That was the second test, and they had failed it again. They weren't prepared for pushback. They operated on intimidation, not legitimacy. And intimidation only worked if people allowed themselves to be cowed. Word spread quickly. Over the next few days, I noticed more neighbors watching me with cautious curiosity. Some gave me nods of quiet approval. Others still avoided eye contact, too afraid to be seen aligning with me, but the seed had been planted. People were realizing someone was standing up to the board, and not just standing, but standing firmly. The HOA, however, didn't back down. If anything, their efforts intensified. Notices began appearing in my mailbox, warnings about unauthorized activity, reminders of community guidelines, even thinly veiled threats about legal action. It was harassment dressed up as bureaucracy. I didn't crumble. I filed each notice neatly in a folder, building my own paper trail, because when the time came, I wasn't just going to reveal my ownership of the docks. I was going to expose the HOA for what it really was. A trio of self-important bullies who had mistaken fear for authority, and I had the perfect stage to do it. By the time the fourth week rolled around, the HOA had turned my life into a daily parade of harassment. Every morning I found a new envelope in my mailbox, stamped with their logo like it was some sort of royal decree. Sometimes it was a friendly reminder about lake access. Other times it was a formal warning about supposed violations. Grass height, outdoor furniture, unsightly items near my garage. The absurdity grew with each notice, and yet I could see their intent. They weren't trying to enforce order. They were trying to wear me down, but I wasn't the type to break easily. Every warning, every threat, I filed away. Each sheet of paper was another brick in the wall I was building against them. I knew that when the time came, evidence would be my strongest weapon. They thought they were tightening the noose. In reality, they were handing me the rope I would use to expose them. Still, I realized it was time to go on the offensive. Up until now, I had tested their boundaries, quietly resisting their authority. But if I wanted to break their grip on the neighborhood, I needed to take control of the narrative. I couldn't wait for them to escalate. I had to escalate first. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind that should have been filled with laughter, boats revving on the lake, kids skipping stones. But instead, the HOA had scheduled one of their infamous compliance walks. That meant the three of them, tall man, sunglasses woman, and scowling man, would roam the streets together, clipboards in hand, marking down every so-called violation they could find. Residents dreaded these walks, often staying indoors just to avoid the humiliation of being inspected. But I didn't hide. I set up a chair right at the edge of my property, facing the lake. Not just a chair this time, an entire setup. A cooler, a folding table, and my fishing rod planted firmly in the sand. I wasn't just enjoying the morning, I was making a statement. I didn't have to wait long. From down the street, I saw them approaching in formation. Their eyes locked on me instantly, and I could see the irritation brewing before they even reached my driveway. The tall man's steps quickened, his jaw clenched tight. The sunglasses woman already had her pen poised. The scowling man's glare could have curdled milk. "This is a direct violation," the tall man barked as soon as he was within shouting distance. "You were explicitly told that lake access requires HOA approval. You are trespassing on community property." I didn't stand. I didn't flinch. I simply leaned back in my chair, took a slow sip from my coffee, and let the silence hang heavy. Then calmly, I replied, "I think you'll find I'm sitting on my property." The scowling man snorted. "Don't play games. The shoreline is HOA-managed land. You signed the covenants like everyone else." That was my cue. I reached into the folder I had brought with me and pulled out a copy of my deed, the survey clearly showing the boundary lines. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and laid it flat on the table. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "says otherwise. Not only is this shoreline mine, but several of those docks you've been regulating, they're mine too, legally. You've been issuing fines for structures that aren't even under your control." For the first time, I saw it. The flicker of doubt in their eyes. The tall man glanced at the paper, then quickly looked away. The sunglasses woman shifted uncomfortably, her smirk faltering. The scowling man leaned in, squinting at the map, like he wanted to tear it in half but couldn't find a reason to. This doesn't change the bylaws," the tall man stammered, though his voice lacked the sharp confidence it usually carried. "The community has an agreement. You can't just ignore that." "Oh, I don't plan to ignore it," I said, my voice calm but steady. "But I do plan to enforce what's mine. You've been overstepping your authority for years, and it stops now." Their faces hardened, but the cracks were showing. They weren't used to being challenged with facts, with evidence. They thrived on fear, and fear alone. Without it, they were nothing more than neighbors in polo shirts. Word spread fast. By that evening, half the neighborhood had heard about my confrontation with the board. Some residents approached me cautiously, curious but wary. Others, like James, were openly thrilled. "You've got them rattled," he said with a grin, clapping me on the back. No one stood up to them like that in years, maybe ever. But I knew rattling them wasn't enough. If I wanted real change, I had to strike harder. The following week, I drafted a letter, not to the HOA board, but to every resident in the neighborhood. In it, I laid out the truth, the property lines, the docks, the legal ownership they had, all been misled about. I explained how the board had overstepped, how they had used fear to control the community, and how things could be different. I made copies for every household and delivered them myself, slipping envelopes into mailboxes under the cover of dusk. The reaction was immediate. Whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to talk. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others were furious, realizing they had been fined or restricted for things the HOA had no real authority over. The seeds of rebellion were sprouting, and the board could feel it. Their response came swiftly. The very next morning, I found not one but 3 notices in my mailbox, formal, threatening, dripping with legal jargon. They accused me of distributing false information, of inciting discord within the community, even of endangering property values. The absurdity would have been laughable if not for the seriousness with which they delivered it. But I didn't laugh. I filed the letters neatly in my growing folder, right alongside the deed and the survey. Each piece of paper was another weapon, another proof of their desperation, because the truth was undeniable now. The neighborhood was waking up, the board was losing its grip, and I was just getting started. By now, the board wasn't just irritated with me. They were threatened. I had exposed their weakness, peeled back the polished veneer of authority they wore like a crown, and revealed it for what it was, paper-thin control. And when people in power feel that grip slipping, they don't retreat gracefully. They claw, they lash out, they strike back with everything they have, even if it means burning down the very community they claim to protect. The retaliation began quietly. 1. Morning, I walked out to my mailbox and found it hanging open, the flag snapped clean off. A coincidence, maybe. But then, the next day, I found muddy footprints stamped across my driveway in the middle of the night, leading nowhere, vanishing into the street. Soon after, someone dumped a pile of rotting grass clippings in my yard, the stench carrying on. The breeze. Petty tactics. Childish even. But they weren't random, they were warnings. And then the real attacks began. The HOA board called a special meeting, plastering the announcement on every community bulletin board and mailing a formal invitation to every household. The notice described it as a discussion about neighborhood unity and compliance. But I knew exactly what it was. A public trial. A spectacle. They weren't content with harassing me privately anymore. They wanted to turn the neighborhood against me. James warned me the night before. "They're going to paint you as a troublemaker," he said, leaning across his porch railing, his voice low. "They'll twist your words, twist the deed, anything to keep their power. They've done it before. People don't fight them because the board always controls the narrative." I smiled faintly. Then it's time someone gave them a new narrative. The meeting was held in the community center, a squat brick building near the playground, with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and nearly every one of them was occupied. Neighbors sat stiffly, clutching copies of the HOA's rules, their eyes darting nervously toward the front of the room, where the 3 board members sat behind a long table like judges at a tribunal. The tall man took the podium first. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and launched into a speech dripping with false concern. "Neighbors, we're here tonight because certain actions have threatened the harmony of our community. We've all worked hard to maintain order and protect our property values. But recently, misinformation has been spread. Claims about property ownership, about the docks, about the very rules that keep this neighborhood safe. Safe. That was the word they always used, as if policing fishing poles and lawn chairs was the same as guarding against danger. The sunglasses woman leaned into her microphone. "This individual," she said, gesturing toward me, "has been distributing documents meant to sow division. He is undermining the community spirit we've built. We cannot allow one person to dismantle years of progress." The scowling man slammed his fist on the table for emphasis. "If we don't act now, chaos will follow. People will think they can do whatever they want. The lake will become a free-for-all, property values will plummet, and everything we've worked for will be destroyed." Theatrical. Overblown. But I could see some of the neighbors shifting uneasily, their doubts gnawed by the board's fear-mongering. The HOA had ruled for so long that many couldn't imagine life without them. When they finally called me up to defend myself, I didn't bother with theatrics. I walked calmly to the podium, set my folder down, and unfolded the deed. "This," I began, holding the document high enough for everyone to see, "isn't misinformation. It's a legal record. My property lines extend into the lake. Several docks, including the ones many of you use, are built on my land. That means the HOA has been charging fees and issuing fines for property they don't even control." Gasps rippled through the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but I pressed on. "For years, they've told you the lake is theirs. To regulate. They've fined you, restricted you, threatened you. But they never told you the truth, that they don't own the very ground those docks stand on. They've built their authority on intimidation, not law. I laid the survey on, the table, the maps and boundary lines undeniable in their precision." Murmurs broke out among the crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering, pointing at the documents. For the first time, I saw something flicker in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. The tall man tried to regain control. "This is out of context," he snapped. "Yes, property lines exist, but community bylaws supersede individual claims. It's about collective good, not selfish ownership." I looked directly at him. If that's true, then why hide it? Why not? Tell people the truth and let them decide? Why fine families for using docks that don't belong to you? The room went quiet. That was the crack I had been waiting for. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years finally spoke up. One woman stood and said the board had fined her $200 for letting her kids jump off their dock. A man admitted he had been warned for grilling too close to the shoreline. Another family said they had paid hundreds in lake access fees just to fish off their own property. The floodgates opened, years of resentment spilling out. The board members looked cornered, their smug composure unraveling. The sunglasses woman tried to hush the crowd, but her voice was drowned by angry shouts. The scowling man slammed his fist again, demanding order, but no one listened. The tall man leaned back in his chair, his face pale, sweat glistening at his temples. For the first time, the HOA wasn't in control. When the meeting finally dissolved into chaos, I gathered my folder and walked out. Behind me, voices rose, angry, demanding, rebellious. The board had tried to stage a public execution of my credibility. Instead, they had exposed their own weakness for everyone to see. But I knew this wasn't the end. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the moonlight shimmer across the lake, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and tension. I had dealt them. A heavy blow, yes. But predators fight hardest when cornered. The HOA wasn't going to slink away quietly. If anything, they were about to get desperate, and desperate people make dangerous moves. After the chaotic town hall meeting, the neighborhood felt different. The pristine lawns, the manicured flower beds, the shimmering lake, they were all still there. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped me in the street, quietly thanking me or nodding in solidarity. The spell of fear the HOA had cast for years was breaking. But just as I had predicted, the board didn't retreat. They doubled down. Within days, letters appeared in every mailbox. Bold, all-caps headlines screamed about preserving community order and protecting our lake. The board painted me as a rogue, a selfish agitator trying to seize control of shared resources. They warned that if I wasn't stopped, the neighborhood would descend into chaos, trash in the water, unsafe docks, lawsuits flying in every direction. The scare tactics worked on some. A handful of neighbors began avoiding me again, whispering behind curtains as I passed. But more and more, people saw through it. They remembered the fines, the harassment, the years of petty control. The board's desperate words only highlighted their panic. Still, I knew they wouldn't stop at letters. The real strike came one quiet evening. I had just finished dinner when headlights swept across my driveway. A truck pulled up and 3 men in reflective vests jumped out. They carried tools, crowbars, hammers, buckets of paint. My stomach sank as I realized what was happening. They marched straight to the shoreline toward the docks. I stepped outside immediately. "What do you think you're doing?" I called. One of them, clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "We're here on HOA orders, routine inspection and maintenance." I laughed bitterly. "At 9 o'clock at night? With crowbars?" They hesitated. But the tall man himself appeared moments later, striding down the path with a flashlight in hand. His voice was sharp, commanding. "These docks are under the HOA's jurisdiction. We're removing unauthorized modifications." I walked down to meet him, deed in hand, and held it up under his flashlight beam. "No," I said firmly. "These docks are on my property. You touch them and you're trespassing." He sneered. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop us?" That was his mistake. Because while he had been plotting this little nighttime raid, I had been preparing. Hidden in the shadows near the porch, my phone was propped up, recording everything. Every word, every action, every face. "You've been harassing me since the day I moved in," I said loudly, making sure the camera caught it all. "And now you're trespassing on private property, trying to destroy structures that don't belong to you. Do you realize what kind of lawsuit this will bring?" For a moment, the tall man froze, his arrogance cracked just slightly, as he realized I wasn't bluffing. The workers glanced nervously between us, clearly not eager to be caught in the middle of something illegal. But he pressed on, trying to save face. "The board will back me. The bylaws will back me. You can't—" "Actually," I interrupted, pulling out my phone, "the county will back me." With one tap, I called the sheriff's office. I calmly explained that trespassers were attempting to dismantle property on my land. Within 20 minutes, flashing red and blue lights washed across the neighborhood. The officers arrived, and I handed them the deed. They studied it, walked the boundary lines, and listened as I replayed the video I had just recorded. By the time they turned to the tall man, his bluster was gone. "Sir," one officer said, "you and your workers need to leave immediately. If you return without proper authorization, you'll be arrested for trespassing." The look on the tall man's face was priceless. Shock, fury, and humiliation all twisted together. He sputtered protests, waving his arms, but the officers weren't swayed. They escorted him and his crew back to the truck, warning them once more before they left. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word of the confrontation spread faster than wildfire. Residents had seen the flashing lights, heard the shouting, watched the board leader get sent home like a scolded child. And when I showed James and a few others the video, they insisted I share it more widely, so I did. I uploaded it to a neighborhood forum the HOA had long controlled. For years, they had used it to announce rules, fines, and threats. Now the same. Forum carried undeniable proof of their abuse of power. The video showed everything: the late-night raid, the attempted destruction, the sheriff's intervention. And beneath it, I posted scans of my deed and survey, inviting everyone to see the truth for themselves. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of comments poured in, residents voicing their outrage. Some shared their own stories of unfair fines. Others demanded the board's resignation. What had started as quiet resentment was now a roar. Within a week, a petition circulated to remove the board members from power. James delivered it to my porch one evening, grinning ear to ear. "We've got the signatures," he said proudly. "They're finished." And he was right. At the next official HOA election, turnout was higher than it had been in years. The tall man, the sunglasses woman, and the scowling man all tried to defend themselves, but it was useless. The evidence was too clear, the anger too strong. They were voted out in a landslide. In their place, new board members were chosen, neighbors who promised transparency, fairness, and respect. The first order of business? Abolishing the ridiculous lake restrictions and refunding residents who had been fined illegally. As for me, I didn't run for the board. I didn't need to. My point had been made. On a warm summer evening weeks later, I sat on my dock with James beside me, both of us fishing rods in hand. Children splashed in the water nearby. Families laughed as they grilled on the shore, and boats drifted lazily across the lake. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. James chuckled, casting his line. "You know, they picked the wrong guy to mess with." I smiled, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "No," I said. "They picked exactly the right guy. Because sometimes the only way to free a lake is to remind people who really owns the water." And in the end, the docks they thought they controlled had become their undoing. Checkmate.